What did we learn from the fact that 6 million Jews were murdered, of which 500,000 were children?
It's hard to believe that actually something like that happened, but the reality is it did not only happen to the Jewish people, it happened to other vulnerable minorities like the LGBTQ people were also sent to concentration camps, or, if you had a young brother or a friend that had a disabled child in the family, they were also sent into extermination camps. And the most incredible part about this whole thing is that Germany, so the country who actually started all that, was at the time the most sophisticated country in the world, even more sophisticated than America 80 years ago, industrially, culturally. And so the fact that they could do that, I would say, has to remind us that it could happen anywhere, anytime, and it could happen to any student's family member. So we have to think about that.
Grandma, what do you say to people who say that the Holocaust never happened?
Hundreds of researchers have documented this for, almost a century now, but most of all, most documents were produced by the Germans themselves during the war. As they invaded all these countries, one of the very first things they did was to request that the racial laws would be implemented. And that meant that every Jewish family had to register with the local police, and if they didn't, their neighbors had to go to the local police and register them so that there would be a record of all where the Jews were. And if they didn't, you could get killed for not doing that. And so in 1942, 2 years into the war, the Nazi leaders got together just one day and adopted a list which called the Eichmann list that showed all the number of Jews that had to be murdered in each country, and they came up to a total of 11 million. Well, now luckily there were some countries where they could never get further. They could never get in Britain. They were stopped in Soviet Union. So they were stopped at 6 million. But that list, that simple piece of paper that's in the exhibition, was the basis for what we call the final solution. And this final solution was a sort of very detailed plan of murdering 11 million Jews at an almost industrial level. Based on their list and this one-day meeting, they set up roundup camps, deportation camps, concentration camps, extermination camps, labor camps. There were camps all over Europe. I think we don't realize, how vast that organization was. And for all of these things, they had very detailed documentation. For example, in the exhibition, there's a binder with the records of just my close family members. There's over 50 records. For example, the labor camp in which my grandfather went, and then the record of when and how he was deported to Auschwitz. For my great-grandmother, there's a record of the list of all the passengers of the train on which she was, with her deportation number. And these were not even trains. They were cattle wagons. People were packed, whole families. The journey to the concentration camps were like 2-3 days. Many elderly and babies died just on the wagon before they even got to the camp. The reality is that we have all these records because the Germans produced them themselves. They were very bureaucratic in that sense, and they produced millions of records, and they testified about all this. So this is why we know in great detail that the Holocaust happened and how many millions, were massacred. The one thing, though, you have to keep in mind that we did not know about these records until half a century after the Holocaust because they were classified. So we found out pretty late about, the creepy details of this whole story.
How come only a handful of people revolted against the final solution?
Most of the people really knew that when the Jews were deported, bad things were going to happen to them. Nothing good could come from that. Most of the people really had no idea of the details of the final solutions, which was kept a very secret plan by the Nazis. They were very tricky about it. They lied to everybody about it. And even the Jews had no idea when they boarded these trains, where the whole families boarded these trains night after night after night from all over Europe. They had no idea where they were going. They were told that they were going to work in the East. They were going to get work, just like when the people were sent to the labor camps. They were told they were going to work. But when these trains arrived, let's say at Auschwitz, which was an extermination camp, the families came off the train, and then there would be a Nazi doctor, and he immediately would do a sort of triage process. He would separate 90% of the weak, the children. He was especially looking for pregnant women, elderly people, sick people, 90%, and they were told they were going for a shower. And in fact, they were going to the gas chambers. They didn't know that. So instead of water coming out of the shower, came poison gas. And an hour later, they were all dead. And then they were burned in tiny ovens and cremated to ashes. And then the other 10%, those who were selected for labor, their fate wasn't that much better, because since the Nazis figured they had so many millions that they could send to labor, they had an endless supply, so they kind of barely fed them. So many people in labor camps died of disease and starvation.
What was it like to grow up after the war?
Well, when my parents came back to Belgium, I grew up in a neighborhood where most were my friends were Holocaust surviving families, which meant that for one survivor, 6 or 7 family members had died in the Holocaust. But we never talked about it. We all knew, but we never talked about it. And definitely this was very painful for our parents, and they absolutely never talked about any of this. So I'm going to say we had a very normal growing up, very normal life, and I'm going to say we had a happy life, because all our parents wanted is for us to have a good future, and they would work very hard so they would get the best possible future.
What about Grandpa?
Your grandpa, my buddy, Donnie, who passed away a few years ago, actually was born in a refugee camp in Switzerland. And he had a baby brother, Alexander, who died in that camp as a baby. His birth was never recorded, his death was never recorded. On occasion, your great-grandma would talk about it, very rarely. So we know it kind of happened. What happened is, at the end of the year, there were hundreds of thousands of people in refugee camps, and they had to stay there sometimes 1 year, sometimes 2 years. Some tried to come back home, but if they had any belongings, they had been taken by their neighbors. If they had a home, most of the time had been taken by the neighbors. They were met with scorn often, because their neighbors would say, "Oh, we didn't expect you to come back," and sometimes they were even beaten. So millions of people had no place to go. So that's when the United Nations created the State of Israel, and that's how millions of Jewish people ended up there after the war.
Right, it's a little bit of gibberish to me, but I don't care.